Hello, hello. We are live. Welcome to my live stream about AI-driven development with AI Unified Process. I was often posting about the process that I'm using and how I do AI-driven development, and people ask me if I can do a short video about that. But I thought maybe having a live stream could be a better option, so you can ask your questions. So please ask the questions if you have some. Then we can look at that. Now, I created an example project for you. I will share the link in the comments, but maybe first we should go ahead and have a look at the process. So the AI Unified Process is something that I created because I heard about spec-driven development. And then I thought, okay, spec-driven development, what exactly could this be? What are the specs? And finally, I ended up defining my own process because there are a lot of tools about spec-driven development. Currently, we have Amazon Kira, for example, or Tesla, or even GitHub Spec Kit. But in my opinion, they are kind of too low level. Means they are focusing on defining interfaces, specifying the implementation of the interfaces. But I usually do kind of data-centric applications. So to say, I do enterprise-like applications also in the small. And that's why I was looking on kind of a different approach. And that's why I also say it's not only spec-driven AI unified process, it's also requirements-driven. How did I get into AI-driven development? Maybe I can tell you a story. I'm in a sports club in Switzerland, and a sports club is a great source of requirements for software development. For example, my sports club does competitions for kids already for 44 years, by the way. And when I was a kid, I was also participating in that competitions. And later I was helping them in the office to get the ranking done. So we created a ranking list based on the results. But the problem, that was all manual work. And when I started as a software developer in 1995, I also started to create software for the sports club. And the example that we will see today is also about this competition application. So we will try to do that with AI. Now, when I was thinking about doing software for my sports club, last year in fall, I was approached by a friend from the club. He said, we have kind of a shift planning, volunteer management application, but this is not good. So you are a software engineer, and maybe you could do better. And I started to think about that and thought, okay, now we have AI, why wouldn't I be able to do that with AI-driven development? And I started my journey with Windsurf like a year ago, and but I had no process, I had no idea how to work. I just started prompting, and this led to kind of a mess by the end because I didn't knew exactly what I was working on. I didn't have a clear backlog, and I also didn't have a clear way to tell AI what to do. And here you can see, so that is AIUP.dev, by the way, the website. And you can go there and read also about my story. And what I was thinking about is a better way to define specifications, for example, that we can generate code from the specifications. And I'm already doing software engineering for 30 years, and I was looking back in my career and was thinking about what really worked well. And I remembered the rational unified process. Maybe some still remember that. It was very popular by end of the 90s, early 2000s. And rational unified process for a lot of people felt a bit bloated because there were a lot of roles, a lot of artifacts, a lot of processes to do software engineering. But in the center, it was iterative and incremental, so kind of agile. And I was thinking about that and what I was thinking about what really worked. And I remembered use cases because today we are doing mostly user stories and all the process and the flow and also the business rules are hidden in acceptance criteria very often. And I was thinking about the use case definition because there we have a precondition, we have postconditions, we have main flows, we have alternative flows, and we have actors. And I thought, hey, why not use system use cases? Because this could be a good fit as an input for AI. And so that's what I did. And I described my process here so you can read about that. So first of all, I think traditional development currently has kind of an issue because if you think of code first development, then um, all the information about how is it working will finally end up in the code because people are lazy, don't do documentation or they get outdated documentation. And the problem is it's very difficult to do modernization later on or also do maintenance. And that's currently a problem that I have because I'm involved in modernization projects. And my problem often is that I can't modernize the application because there are no requirements or no specifications. So I was thinking about that as well. So I said, okay, let's go into spec-driven because if we put the specification in the center, we will also end up with documentation for further modernization. So that's kind of the idea here. Now, let's switch to the page here. So that's also described on AIUP.dev. And then we have a lot of information here. And if you scroll down, you will find the process. And the process has phases, but that doesn't mean that the process is kind of waterfall. It's just that the requirement engineering, for example, comes first. Even if you do an iterative incremental development or an agile development, you first have to think about the requirements, then you can do specification and implementation. But this will not be an upfront process, this will be an incremental flow. That's very important to say here. So what we have here in the process, we have kind of a vision. We will see that in the demo later. That's just the description on what we want to do, what we want to achieve with the software we want to build. And then we start with gathering requirements. So this is usually the job of requirements engineer, business analyst, or stakeholders that gather requirements and put that in kind of a requirements document or requirements catalog as it's described here. And this requirements catalog is then the input for the ongoing specification work. So specification is not only to create use cases, as I said, but we also need kind of an entity model. As I said, I'm doing enterprise software. I do kind of data-driven applications, and there we need an entity model. So the entity model is also something that we can communicate with the users. So it means we also have things like, for example, domain-driven design, where we have a ubiquitous language if we split that in bounded context, for example. So this will form the entity model where we discuss with stakeholders also about how they want to manage data and how they want to see their system based on a model. What we also can do from the requirements catalog then is derive acceptance tests. So we need acceptance tests in terms of we need to verify if all the requirements are implemented. So these are things. And what we can do, we also can generate acceptance tests based on the requirements, for example. But today I'd just like to talk about software development and not about testing in particular. We will see testing as well, but not in terms of acceptance testing. Now, if we have the requirements, as I said, we have the requirements catalog or the requirements document as an input, and then we can start generate things. We could generate a use case model, for example, that we have an overview of all the use cases in the system. We can refine this model, and then we can start to generate system use cases one by one. So iterative means I usually work on a single use case. Maybe I can also split my work and work on multiple use cases, but usually I do just one use case at one time. And then I generate a system use case description that later on can be used to generate code and tests and so on. And as you can see here in my process, if you look at the boxes, you see that these boxes are AI generated. So AI generates something. And we also have the human in loop. So that means every time you generate something, someone has to review the output. So in terms of code and tests, this will be the developer who can do that. In terms of use cases and entity model, this will be something that you discuss with the requirements engineer, the business analyst, or the stakeholders, depending on how you are working. In the middle, we also see that we can generate some software architecture documentation. Maybe we have some requirements, non-functional requirements, quality requirements, or some other requirements from maybe an operations department that can all be taken into account to generate the software architecture document, but that's also something that we don't look into right now. So that's kind of my process. We have 6 fundamental principles. So it's requirements driven. It's AI assistant because we need kind of an AI to help with the generation. And then we do an iterative approach. So we do specs, we do code, we do tests. Depending on what we are doing, we could do test first. Test first or test last depends a bit on the type of application you're building. I'm usually building data-centric applications with a UI, and then doing a test-driven approach with UI testing is a bit difficult, so to say. But we can do test-driven development if we want to test our services. For example, if we have heavy business logic, we would do test-driven first so that we can also do that. The important thing is that everything is test protected, means that we can later on change the code, and we need kind of protection that we don't break anything. That means we are focusing a lot on testing. So not only the acceptance testing, but also unit testing or integration testing, mostly integration testing, because my applications are usually data-driven. So testing the application without the database usually doesn't make sense in most parts of the application. Then it's also stakeholder-centric because system use cases, requirements documents can be revised by business people or by stakeholders. And finally, it's traceable because we can check based on, for example, the version history, or also doing tracking in kind of another way. I will show you that as well, how we can do that. So let's go to the example. To get a better understanding, I can show you an application. It's called JTAF-CH. JTAF stands for Java Track and Field, because it's an application to do track and field competitions. And the result of the application is a competition ranking. So we will get a PDF generated where we can see, for example, the competition with categories, and the kids are in categories. So we have Lucas and Ari, for example, here. And what's below is the event, for example, 8-meter run or long jump or shot put. And this will be given some points calculated based on a formula, and finally we have the ranking list. And the application can be used to modify data. So for example, if I log in here for the application, then I can select an organization. Let's select that one. And here we have the competitions for the last few years, for example, and there we can define the events. So all the disciplines the users can compete in. We can manage clubs. We can manage also the athletes. And finally, we can enter results like that. So we can see, let's see, Lucas, for example. And here we can see that the result, and here the points are automatically calculated. So that's the purpose of the application. And that's also the use case I'm using for my demo. So let's go to the project. By the way, I can put this into AI track and field. Here we are. Can put that in the comments. So then you also see the code, and the project, by the way, is a Spring Boot application. And the Spring Boot application is using Vaadin as a front-end library and Juke as a data access library. So Vaadin is a special type of UI application framework where you can write your application code in Java, and during runtime it will be a single page application. So every component that we have on the server side will be mapped to a component on the client side. And on the other hand, we have Juke. That's kind of a type-safe way to write SQL. That's my stack that I usually use. That's also why I use it for the demo. And I also use it for another reason, because Vaadin and Juke is Java as well as Spring Boot, and using just one ecosystem for generating the application from front end to back end can be very beneficial in terms of data-centric application development, but also for AI, because you are in a single deployment unit, you are in a single ecosystem. You just have to master that also for reviewing and stuff like that. That's very, very beneficial. So you can have a look at the POM file. You will see that's a regular Spring Boot application with some additional libraries here, like the Juke version, the Vaadin version, and so on. And but that's also, if you run that, you will see how it works. So the application is already there, and that's a starting point. So we have the main branch, and that's the starting point. What we have here is just the scaffold. And that's something that I learned. And I think that's very important to scaffold your application by your own. So don't use AI to generate a Spring Boot application, for example, because you will get an old Spring Boot version for sure. And you also will get outdated information, how, for example, use test containers. In my case, I also use test containers because I use Postgres database. And this may change from Spring Boot version to Spring Boot version. And so it's very important that you go to start.spring.io, for example, or use the wizard in the IDE to generate your application. No matter what technology you use, you should always do that by hand. And then for the demo, I'll use Cloud Code. So that's what's already open here in the terminal. Cloud Code has certain integration with IntelliJ, so it will show the diff of the files, for example, in IntelliJ as a diff view. I could also use Juni, which is also included here in my case in IntelliJ, or I could use Codex or Gemini CLI or whatever tool I like. So my process is not related to any tool that you use. And in my opinion, it's very important to use a tool that you're familiar with, because you have to learn how it works, and you have to learn the features, you have to get a feeling how the tool reacts. So it's the same as you learn a new IDE, for example, you learn a new tool, and that's the AI assistant. And that's why I stick with Cloud Code, because I like how Cloud Code works. And usually I run Cloud Code in a terminal and not inside the IDE as I do here. It's just for the purpose of the demonstration. Usually I have multiple terminal windows open because I work on, for example, on multiple use cases in parallel. And for that I use Git work tree. So I create branches inside my local Git repository where I can switch for doing the work with AI. And the IDE I mainly use for reviewing the code. So I do code review or documentation in the IDE, but let the AI tool run in a terminal. But that's a matter of taste. So you can use Visual Studio Code with Copilot, or you could use Juni. It doesn't really matter. It's very important that you learn the tools. That's the most important thing. Now, the one good thing about Cloud that I like is that I can define commands. So let's switch to another branch. The first one is called requirements, and let's go there to check out what we have. But the difference between the branches here is that I have already initialized Claude, because this takes us a while. What does that mean? Claude has a command /init. So everything you do with Cloud Code is with slash, and you can get init. And init means it will then analyze your source code or your project and then come up with a Cloud MD. So the Cloud MD is kind of guidelines. If you would have Juni, for example, then it's the guidelines MD file. It's kind of a system prompt. And that's also generated by Cloud Code. So it looks at the code. Then it finds out that I use Spring Boot 3.5.7. That's the most recent one, but I use not the newest Java version, so I could update to Java 25 already. It uses Vaadin and Juk, as I said, and Postgres database. And then it defines something that later on the agent can look at and use that. We also have some information. For example, I use custom equals and hashcode Java generator. That's just a detail, but Cloud Code found this out, so it knows now that equals and hashcode are, for example, generated by primary key. And then we have different information. And what I usually do is now I add my own guidelines. So, for example, which components it should use from Vaadin usually, or how it should use Vaadin, or how it should use Juk, for example. And then I can add that. I can also define how it should structure it, how it should be testing done, and stuff like that. So that's really kind of the guidelines, and that's not different from if you work with the regular development team, because there you also have guidelines, because you need to agree on a way how you build your application. So that's the reason for that file. And we also have a package structure. For example, here I could add that I would have a layering by feature, for example, instead of a layered way of doing that. Or I could say use clean architecture as the package style. Whatever goes into this documentation here. Now that's kind of the starting point. This will grow over time because you will realize that in certain situation, the agent doesn't exactly create what you were looking for, or how you like to have the code created, for example, or the tests, and you can add that right away here inside this file. So every tool has kind of this file. There is also agents MD. That's kind of an IDE to define a standard of doing these guideline files. One feature, and that's more or less the only feature I will talk about Claude Code. If you're interested in Claude Code, there are plenty of videos on YouTube as well on how to use it, how to work with the latest features. The only feature that I like to show you is commands, because these commands are great for demos like that, or if you do repetitional tasks, you can define your own commands. For example, we have the first step. So we want to create requirements, for example, from a vision file. That's what I already did in this branch. And there we have kind of the prompt that I would write anyway, so I could put it in a command so I don't have to type it anytime. So these are some information. So I need a requirements MD file. By the way, I always generate text, so all my documentation will be marked down, and diagrams, for example, will be Mermaid or Plan to UML. I use both because Mermaid is missing a diagram type that I use. Mermaid JS doesn't support use cases, but Plan to UML does. So I usually use Plan to UML for the use case diagram and Mermaid for all the other diagrams. Mermaid has an advantage over Plan to UML because it's written in JavaScript. It renders more or less in every place. So, for example, you can put it on a website directly, or if you use GitHub or GitLab, then Mermaid will also be rendered automatically. So that's the first step. That's not my step because I'm not a requirements engineer, but we have already in the docs folders 2 documents. So we have the vision, and here we have the overall goal of the application. So I want to create a similar application to that I've shown you before. So I want to have competitions. I want to manage the competitions and any categories with the gender, year, from and to, so the age of the kids. Then I have athletes that are grouped automatically based on the year of birth. Then we have athletes that could be part of a club, for example. And finally, we calculate the results based on the points based on the results. And there is an official ranking formula from the World Athletics Federation that can be used with some parameters. And finally, we need a ranking list, and that's it. So that this is the project vision. And based on that, I also used AI to do that. I derived functional and non-functional requirements. So that's usually not the way you're doing it, because usually you're gathering requirements. That's a job of a requirements engineer, for example. And here, the requirements in my case are defined as user stories. And they all have an ID because the ID is used to track the requirements in test, for example, or in use cases, that we have this traceability from requirements to specification, for example. And you can look at that if you like to. It's not very important currently. And then we have non-functional requirements. For example, we have responsive design and other things. There could be some guidelines or thing you need to add from your company, for example, or from your architect that tell you to do something. And I also use status definitions, so I can track the requirements, or AI can track the status, because I can ask AI, please update the status of a requirement if it's done. And I also use priorities because I need to know which requirements should be used or created first. So these are the requirements. Now let's have a look at my process, what we want to do with the requirements. Let's go to that. So we have the requirements catalog already. And now we can use that to generate use cases and the entity model. Okay. What I do first is create a use case model. So I don't want to create all the use cases or generate the use cases at once, because I want to do that one by one based on the requirements. So I also have a command, create use case. And here you see the prompt, so create or update plant UML use case diagrams in a certain file based on the requirements. And each use case must have a unique ID and a description, again, for tracking purposes. And Pet is asking, what about using ASCII-Doc instead of Markdown? For sure, you can use ASCII-Doc. I use Markdown because it gets rendered everywhere. And I'm fine with what Markdown is doing. But we are also discussing in a current customer project about ASCII-Doc, because with ASCII-Doc we have a lot of, or we could do kind of a document flow. For example, with one customer, we generate HTML pages based on ASCII-Doc during the build time, because not everybody in the project team may have access to the Git repo, or not everybody wants to use a Git repo. So that's why we very often use also ASCII-Doc. But here I don't have a strong opinion on that. I know ASCII-Doc is more powerful. You can do a lot more with that. You have doc kind of doc flow that you can use and stuff like that. But here, for my example, I'm perfectly fine with Markdown. And Markdown, by the way, also renders, at least in IntelliJ, also the mermaid diagrams, for example, something that will not happen with ASCII-Doc, as far as I know. Okay, so let's start with that one. So we have the requirements here and the vision, and now I can create, for example, now let's get first to the entity model. I start usually with that one. So I create the entity model because then I can discuss about the entities with stakeholders. And here I also created a command which says I need an entity model markdown file that has entities with a description, attributes, columns, type, data types, validation rules. The entities must use sequence diagrams, sequence for primary keys. That's something that is kind of a guideline. And then I also want to have an ERD diagram, but that should only show the entity names, no columns, and the relationships. So I usually do that because I don't want to have a huge diagram with a lot of attributes. That's not very interesting, in my opinion. There are two views, in my opinion, on the entity model. On the one hand, you want to see the relationships. And there you just need the name of the entity. You don't need the attributes. And on the other hand, you want to see the details of an entity. And this may work better, at least if you have large entities, if it's in a kind of a table or in a list, that you can review that and don't have to look at the diagram. So you reduce the size of the diagram. It's better for getting kind of a bird's eye view, but then you just define the entities as text. And so let's start with the second one. So I use the command here, and now Claude is running. It will analyze the requirements documentation and then come up with the solution. And the solution that will be there, or the ID that will be there, is just an ID. So that's not something that we blindly accept and go further. We will review everything. So the key of doing AI-driven development, or the most important thing, in my opinion, is to review everything. And that's a very important fact, because this changes the way we work. So because we generate a lot, also the requirements engineers or business analysts or tester will generate stuff. We don't do manually creating programs, for example. We generate that. And this will take us away from the code a bit. So that's will result maybe in different other problems. I don't want to speak about that. But it will change kind of the way we do software development. So we are not coders anymore. We are people that are creating solutions. And if you look back in history, that was the goal initially. So we didn't have people that were just coding. We had people that were creating solutions. And the solution is everything. So we need from architecture to the code, to testing, to requirements and stuff like that. So that's a very, very important fact. And that's why we have to review everything. When I started with that process, by the way, reviewing code can be more tiring than coding, because if you're doing software development, so you're programming, you get into a kind of a coding flow, and this feels good and it works, and you forget to take a break, you just work. If you do reviews, you don't have that, so you will not get in kind of a review flow. You more or less will be kind of, yeah, how should I say? It will be kind of a task shift now and then, because you have to review code, you have to review documentation, maybe you have to review tests, and that could be more tiring than actually coding. So now it looks like Cloud Code is done. So we could review that here or just apply, and then we can have a look at the document once it's done. And then we will see what we have here. So let's reload that. Here we have the diagram, or the entity model. And as you can see, it created not exactly what I wanted, because it added the attributes here. So I was telling not to do that, but it did. So that's something that we have to figure out, or I have to figure out how to do my prompt better, that it doesn't add the columns in the diagram. But finally, it managed to create a diagram. And that's the good thing about diagram as code, or everything as code, because AI is much better in creating text than creating diagrams. So I would never advise AI or tell AI to generate a picture of a diagram. First of all, you cannot change it. Secondly, it can't be compared in Git. And lastly, it's much better if you create the diagram as code for the AI. And here we have information about the attributes, and we also have kind of validation rules. So for example, the year from must be less or equal to the year 2. We have 2 genders, male and female. And we also have relationships to the requirements. So that's something that AI does very well, because it tells you where it has found, for example, this requirement that is added here. I don't review that. So usually I would go ahead and review that, discuss this diagram or this model with my stakeholders and change it here. So I don't, it depends on what changes could be. If I have large changes, for example, I would say, okay, remove the attributes from the diagram. I would do that with Claude. But if I have some changes, for example, the birth year should be year of birth or something like that, I would do that manually. So this doesn't mean if you use AI, you should use AI for everything. You can also do that by hand. So that's something we could do here. So that's the result of this step. And the next step that we want to take is to create a use case diagram. Here I use Plan2ML because Mermaid doesn't have use case diagrams. And what's important, by the way, is to clear the context, because I don't want to use the same context. First of all, the context size is limited, or the context window is limited, but I want to start from scratch for the next step, so I can use clear. If I don't do clear and the context window reaches a certain size, it will be kind of a compact and remove some of the context for you. So the next step that I want to do is create the use case diagram. And let's go to that. Could you also transfer the markdown files with commands from Cloud Commands folder in Git repos? It looks like good step-by-step. Thank you. What do you mean by transfer the markdown files with the commands? Maybe you can clarify that. So this is already done, it looks like. So let's go ahead and see what the model will look like. So let's have a look at that one. I need this, but that one. So it created the use case diagram, and now the question is if this looks good or not. So that's again a job for the reviewers, job for the requirements engineers, discuss with the stakeholders. It's interesting that it creates some kind of contexts or packages inside the use case diagram. Didn't expect that. So this really depends. So one important fact, and that's also written on my page, is the thing about the non-deterministic behavior of AI. Because when I started to talk about spec-driven development, a lot of people said, oh, that reminds me of model-driven development. But it's not the same. So model-driven development is something you create a model that's defined with a DSL or UML, and you have kind of a limited vocabulary that you can use. But because this is very limited, what you can do there, it can generate the code exactly the same twice. So it's kind of pre-compiler that compiles from a model some code. But here what we are doing, we are using AI. And AI with LLMs just is statistics. So it generates tokens, it generates text, so in form of the markdown or the diagrams or later of the code. And this is non-deterministic. So we need to find a way to work with that. So we can try to limit that, so to add more guardrails and guidelines and do better requirements, do better use cases, do better entity models to reduce the amount of things that could change. But you can't remove that completely. That's simply impossible. And what I also don't do is if I create code from a use case, I change the use case and let AI update the code. I don't regenerate the code because you will not get the same result. And that will also be the same if I would delete the UML use case diagram and regenerate it, I will get another one. So that's very important to think about and not to rely on kind of the AI totally. So that's what's generated. So we could have a look at that and say, okay, let's start with competition. We can create competition and we can edit and delete competitions. Now the question is if we want to split that in create, edit, and delete, or we want to have a single use case that just says, for example, manage competitions. So this will take kind of or a little work to get there. And I also prepared that. So let's remove that for now and move to another branch. So here we have the use cases that are more dense or very more simple because I just need that for the demonstration. And here we just have manage categories, manage athletes, and here also manage competitions. So we have the use case model, and also the entity model is a bit different. Where we have it, so the entity model in that case is as requested. So I just have the overall diagram. I can see that I have competition with categories with events. So an event is a discipline or like 80 meter sprint or long jump or high jump. I have categories per athletes per category. An athlete can have a result. The result belongs to an athlete and an event. And an athlete could be member of a club. And the result is recorded for a competition. So we can have as many competitions with different results. So that's the starting point. And here we have kind of a very simple description of the attribute. So that's why I did it step by step, because as it's non-deterministic, every time I do the demonstration, I get kind of a different result. Pet is asking, how many times are you faster than working this way? That's a very difficult question, because I never measured or didn't compare working with AI or without AI. But I can tell from this example here, so let's go to the use cases again. So we have here around 12 use cases. And if I would implement everything here, I would add some additional functionality, because the JTAF application that I've shown you is multi-tenant capable. So there you can have multiple tenants, organizations, because we have different organizations working with that application. So this would add some additional use cases. And implementing the application as it is now, it took me, I don't know exactly, a few months. So I do not work full-time on this application, but with that approach here, I could do that much faster. Because the difference is I would invest more time in specs and less time in actually coding. But what's also very important to say is this use case that we're building here is very well known also by AI. So that means we are not the only people in the world that trying to manage track and field competition. So this is already a solved problem. And that's why this is also very fast in creating specifications, for example, or generating specifications. If you are in an industry where that is not very well known, or maybe it's not public what you're doing there, you would invest way more time in that. And that was very interesting, because a friend of mine today posted on LinkedIn about that we should really focus on problems and not on solutions. Because very often, if you talk with stakeholders, you already get kind of a partial solution for their problem from them. But you should always start with the problem. And here we start with the problem because we start with requirements and use cases. And so it's very hard to say how much faster that I am. But currently I'm working on this volunteer management software. I will not show it. It's not open source. It's closed source, because it will be a product. It should be released by the end of the year. And I'm very far, and I created I implemented a lot of use cases there. And I would say without AI, I couldn't do that simply in my spare time. So it's not, I did that in the evening or on weekends. And the progress that I made until today, I would need 2 additional developers to do that. So maybe it's 1 to 3. It really depends. Fine. So this is the person that was posting on LinkedIn. Adrian, welcome. Let's go ahead and try to implement something. So let's start with, for example, the management competitions, because this is, as you see in the entity model, the top entity. That means we need that, otherwise we could not start. And here I have, first of all, I need a database. And I said this is a data-centric application. Your application may be different. So we have our entity model here, and this entity model I will use to generate database migrations. I use Flyway, and so I have here a command where I can tell, please add the database migration, and this will run. That will give me time to add another question. Oh, okay. Maybe this is a misunderstanding. I didn't say that I don't regenerate the model. I said that I don't regenerate the code. So the process initially, or not initially, during development of the application would be to refine also the models, refine the use cases. And that's very important, you need to use a version control. Because first of all, as I said, I do parallel work with work trees, but that's just a detail. The important thing is I always need to go back and forth and try something and delete it and go back and stuff like that. So I do a lot of branching, usually, not here, but usually. And on the other hand, because I use Git, I also can tell AI to update the code based on the changes that were made on the use cases or on the entity model, because it knows what has changed based on the history. And on the other hand, you can install Git, you can install Claude to Git and use Claude to do pull request reviews, for example. That's also very, very helpful. And yeah, that's mainly also important. So the important thing, in my opinion, is using text for requirements and diagrams, and heavily use version control for your work. So you can also work on that. Cool. So let's have a look what has been generated by for the data migration. And here again, I didn't tell anything. So in that case, AI decided to create one migration per entity. I don't like that. So I would delete that and regenerate that, for example. But looking at, for example, the competition table, there are some things that are not good. Starting here, increment by 1 doesn't make sense. Why? Because this could generate a performance problem if I want to bulk insert data in my database. Let's assume that I have kind of a participant or a kind of a member database from our club, and I want to import all members as athletes in my application. This could be a performance bottleneck. So that's not a good style, first of all. So that's something I would delete. Because I use Juke, it knows that I would use the competition sequence as a default value, for example, so that's perfectly fine. Here we have, for example, a length of the varchar field. That's probably also not a good idea, or at least we don't know how long it should be. Why? Because it's not in the entity model. So usually you have to add lengths and also example data maybe, or rules about what could be put into the data, stuff like that. But what's interesting is that's also something that varies. I'm using Postgres. Postgres has a data type enum. So the status here is now a varchar field with a default value. and with the check constraint. So that's great. Because in my opinion, you have to make sure that the database stays consistent. That also means if you're using enums somewhere, you should check the values. But you could use an enum type. But I didn't tell that. So as I said, you need to add guidelines and also guidelines how to use things. So in my opinion, in my case, this would mean, okay, Flyway initial script, just one file, not per entity. Then I could tell, okay, use enum values instead of the checks constraints here, some of these things. And it also adds indexes. And maybe that's also not a good idea. So maybe I will never filter by status or competition date. I will never do that. So I could delete that. So that means everything that's generated here must be reviewed, right? What I do now is I use compile because I'm using Juke, and Juke will generate the code from the database. I need that for the first steps. So here we see, let's reload that. Here you see the Juke generated code. You can look at that. It doesn't really matter, but I have a table, a class per table for my Juke code. So this would be fine, in my opinion. So I'm ready to start coding. And I said that's a database first approach. If you use JPA, for example, you could do a code first approach and generate the entity model first and let then generate the database based on the entity model, whatever you like. This is just my stack with Vaadin and with Juke. So I did the database migration. And what I need next is a use case specification. And here, that's a bit of a bigger command. So I have can also use arguments, for example, here. And then I did a small template how I would like my use case look like. So I have an overview with an ID, with a name, actors, a goal, and the status. The status is important that I can track if I'm already done with the use cases. Then I have preconditions, main success scenario, alternative flows, post conditions, and business rules, for example. So this is just an example template. This really depends on your requirements engineers or business analysts or designers or however they are called, and they can go ahead and define the template. But the template is very important that every use case finally will look the same. And so we can go ahead and say, okay, let's start with the use case specification. And here I just use the ID of my use case. So I say, please implement or specify use case 001, and now it starts to generate that. In the meanwhile, maybe I can go to my real world project and tell you and show you how I do use cases there, because this is a bigger problem, a bigger project. And here I have a bigger use case model, because this use case are rather big. And this system, it's called Voluntarix, by the way, voluntarix.com. You can register for a newsletter if you're interested in volunteer management and shift assignments and stuff like that. And here it's split into kind of features of the system, because it will be too big. I also have multiple actors, not just one. And then everything is split into that features. And so I have an event management, for example, where we can see the use cases here. And here I also use the use cases to track. So to see how many use cases are already done. And there's also a use case implementation tracking, where I have all the use cases, and you can see the status, and somewhere we have the information how many use cases I'm already done with. Notes, where is it? Here. So I have a total of 65 use cases, 20 are implemented. That's the minimal viable product. So currently I'm in the kind of a phase where I try to add more end-to-end tests to stabilize the system, to find bugs, to fix bugs, and to get ready for the beta phase. So that's but I did kind of so 1/3 of everything, and that's very helpful. And here you see an actual use case description. This is much longer than what we have here. So I also add things like that. So I know this use case has been done in July, for example. And then we have preconditions and the flow. And here we see that we are really detailed. So I could add activity diagrams or sequence diagrams to visualize the flow, for example. I could also add UI mockups. For example, I could use Figma to design that and use Figma then to create the UI, for example. And here you also see information about required and stuff like that. And this information is taken from the entity model in my case. So this is also pre-generated, and we have different alternative flows and stuff like that. So that's way, way more in detail. So that's from my project. And now we have the use case specification. The first one is already done. So it, as you can see, it used the template, and we have just one actor, that's the administrator. And then here we see that the administrator must navigate to the management interface, then create competition, then enter the data and so on. We can edit competition and delete competitions. Then we have validation flows. I don't review that. That looks good. Fine, we're good. And now the last thing that I like to show you, I will not show you testing today because testing will take too long. I will do a separate session about AI-driven testing, but I want to implement that. And now the point is, how can I do that? But before I just answer another question. Large number of tokens, yes. So you didn't see that, but I use Cloud Code Max. So that means I'm on the Max subscription and have a lot of tokens to spend. If I would stay on the Pro, that's around $20, I think, a month, then I would run out of tokens after half a day. So that's probably the point. So that means I have a flat rate, so I don't use the API. That's very important because if you use the API, you pay per token. If you have a subscription, then you pay for a certain amount of tokens, and that's way cheaper than using the API. Right? So in my case, I pay $200 a month for Cloud Code or for Cloud, and this is enough to me. So I use AI or Cloud Code every day, and I never run out of tokens so far. But I don't do a massive parallelization currently because there are other people in AI-driven field that do a lot of parallelization. There is Ruben Cohn, who created Cloud Flow, where you can have a kind of a team of agents that run in parallel and work on a shared memory to exchange information. And he uses a lot of tokens. Yeah, that's true. But to be honest, in my case, you have to always calculate the price in relation to the work you will probably save. So for me, $200 are cheaper than working on my own on the project because programming and specification stuff, doing and stuff like that without AI would require a lot more time. That would be much more expensive than using Cloud Code. Cool. So let's go ahead and try to implement that. Now, implementing needs some additional, maybe additional guardrails or something like that. And I don't know if you know about MCP, but MCP stands for Model Context Protocol and is a way to add kind of an API and tools to AI. And I use some MCP tools. So I use Context 7. Context 7 is a general purpose MCP server where a lot of documentation is served that was initially copied from GitHub, markdown files from open source projects, for example, or from websites. Then there is a JavaDoc MCP server from James Ward from AWS. Then I have a Juke MCP server that I created and the Caribou testing for the testing framework that I also created. Maybe let's have a look at the Juke server. Then we see there are some tools. So you can get SQL examples, you can search documentation, or AI could use that to search documentation, get code generation guide, and stuff like that. Or we have Playwright. Playwright is an end-to-end testing tool, and the Playwright MCP server can be used to kind of use the browser during AI sessions to take screenshots or have a look at the DOM if you're looking for problems, for example. That's very helpful. Then I have SonarQube because all the code that is generated will also be checked by SonarQube. That's, to me, very important. I want to have clean code, so code that follows some rules. Then I have Vaadin. Vaadin as an official MCP server as well, so you can search documentation or get full documentation from a certain component. For example, you get information about Vaadin versions, you get components, you get Java API, we have React API, you get web component API, so component styling and so on. And that's very helpful because this gives AI access to the information that it needs to generate the code, for example. But this doesn't make sure that MCP is used. So you can force or try to force AI to use a certain MCP. But in my case, here I added that to the implement command. But the question is if it will do that or not. So we will see. So to go to the last step for today, I'll try to implement, oops, sorry. I have to tell which use cases I have to implement, the use case 001. Let's try to do that. And now I make that a bit bigger so we may see exactly what's happening. So here, where we are, now it reads the documentation. Here you can see it has found the use case documentation. Then it goes to the entity model, it uses the migrations to figure out the data. And then it will have a look what's already implemented. Here it will look for the Juke generated classes to find out how they work. Now, as you can see, it goes to the MCP server of Vaadin. So it checks out CRUD operations, form layout, binder, dialogues, stuff like that. And that's very helpful because now AI is getting back documentation on how to use a confirm dialog, for example, or how to use a grid. And now it detects that there's a competition table, competition record that is generated by Juke that it can be used. And now it creates the CRUD operations. For sure, this is a very, very simple example because CRUD, that's very simple to implement, right? So that's not really rocket science. I didn't tell exactly what to do, right? I didn't tell if it should create repositories, services, or if it should directly use Juke from the UI or something like that. So it will do as AI thinks that it could be the best. And this would probably be because it creates a service here, because somehow AI knows based on this data that you don't access Juke directly from the UI, for example. But as you can see here, just in the snippet, it doesn't create a repository. So we will see that after it's done. And now it starts create a computation view, and now it compiles the code. Clean compile is not necessary because clean would then also require to regenerate the Juke generated code. So probably I should also go ahead and tell my guidelines how to do better. But it's just a demo, so we just get what's done. So now it tells me that it's done already. So let's try that. I start my application. Not this one. Stop. That's not a good idea. By the way, if you look at my code, I use test containers also in combination with Spring Boot. And Spring Boot has a great integration of test containers. That means I can use test containers also during development. The trick how to do that is just to create, not this one, but this one, the test applications that will be used to start the application. And this imports test contains configuration where we have a service connection, and the service connection annotation means it will create a Postgres container, and the Postgres container URL, username, password will then be bound to Spring data source URL, Spring data source username and password, and it will be auto configured, right? Don't do that in production because never use latest from any Docker image because you don't know what you will get. But I start that, and I started in debug mode. Not that one, that one. Started in debug. And now it starts Docker and applies the flyway migrations. And the application is running. It's starting. Let's go back here. What's also interesting, if you use IntelliJ with the Spring Debugger plugin, the combination will also generate a data source directly in the database view of my IntelliJ IDE, and here you can see the data. So we could have a look at the flyway schema history and see, okay, the scripts are executed, successful. So that's perfectly fine. Let's go to my application, make that a bit bigger. It couldn't navigate to root because there's nothing at root, but there seems to be a competition view. Here we are. And now I can add a competition. For example, let's say that's test. The date will be on, let's say, Saturday. Location will be in Bern. It's planned. And I can save it. And it created it. I can edit data or delete the data, and it worked, right? So that's pretty nice, right? So it took me, don't know how long I talked to you, maybe 2 or 3 minutes to generate the crude view based on Vaadin. Now, why did this work so well? The point is, it worked so well because I'm using Vaadin. And because Vaadin has an MCP server, and with that combination, it's very simple, or not simple, it's very good for the AI agent to generate the application. Because if we look at the code, so we now have to look at the code for sure. So we need to do a review. Let's start with the competition. So we have just a view and a service, so I didn't tell anything. Let's start with the service. Here we see it's a service, it's transactional. That's probably good, probably not because we just have or we have also find methods where we don't want to start the transaction, maybe. So that's probably not a good idea to have that on the method or the class level. But it uses at least constructor injection, which is recommended. It uses find all, so no paging, right? So it doesn't use paging. It uses find by ID. We have a create method where it saves the record. We have an update method and a delete. And we also have information if it has results, because it probably want to check that it can't be deleted. But as I know Juke very well, it doesn't make sense to have a create and an update method, because if we use the record that is generated, that's kind of an implementation of an active record pattern, we can use just store. So Juke will then either execute an insert or an update statement. Then let's have a look at the competition view. So this looks pretty good. I would also use vertical layout. The competition service is injected. It creates a grid. It creates a form, and then we see the grid with the columns. That looks pretty good. It has action buttons that open for edit. Then we have the form, and the form is an inner class. That's also very nice, because otherwise we would have a separate class maybe, or if it's not very well structured, it would create that in the constructor or something. Now that perfectly makes sense, because this is a dialog. Here we see something that I don't like. It uses kind of full qualified names. We could add that to the guidelines now and say don't use full qualified names. Then it creates fields. I didn't tell about internationalization, so we want to translate that, but currently it's not translated. We have that here. And then it uses form layout, which is a good choice. And it sets max lengths and binds stuff. So that's that's half good, because required and things like that you also do via binder. So for example, the name field has set required, but also the binder has as required. So that's 2 times the same, but not in the same way. So that's something we have to change. Then we have buttons. We have different titles depending on what's going on. We have save with the binder, validate. We have create or update, which could be the same method. And then the grid will be refreshed. And as you could see, this works. We also have cancel dialog. We didn't write that out. Let's do that. So I could enter here some code, and then I do cancel. That's possible. Let's create one again. Save it. And if we edit that, probably if we change that to name and we cancel, doesn't happen. Don't know when will the cancel be used. Cancel button, cancel. Binder has changes. Okay, the binder doesn't have changes. Okay, so there's a bug probably. We have to check why this doesn't work better. But overall, I'm quite happy with the application. Maybe something that is missing, I didn't tell, is we don't have a layout. And I could go ahead and now the question is, how do I do that? Do I add that to the requirements that we need kind of a layout around? But I could say here, add app layout. And if I want to reference files here, I can use the @ sign and say I want to update the competition view, for example. Add an app layout, and the layout must use app layout. Now I know that there is an app layout because I know Vaadin quite well. And now I want to just do that, for example. This should also relatively should work fast. In reality, you wouldn't do that, right? In reality, you would start with the layout because probably you have somewhere kind of a Figma file or a mock-up design that exactly tells how your application should look like. And then you would start with this layout. Maybe you have a design system internally in a company. And so you would have some information about that, for example. But as you can see here, it created the main layout and it's updating the competition view to use that layout. Let's see what happens. Now, when we wait, we can also talk about kind of an issue with that, because now we are waiting, right? We are waiting for AI. And that's something that I had to learn, because when I started with that, I was always waiting. So I was looking what AI is doing. Sometimes it's interesting, sometimes it's less interesting. But you shouldn't do that. So you could also add bigger tasks to the AI that takes longer. And during that time, you should find a way to do something else. So you shouldn't go to YouTube and watch videos. Maybe you could work on the specification for the next requirement or the next use case you want to implement. So it really requires that you start multitasking, kind of. And as you can see here, the competition management worked. So the layout worked. We have here competition. That's also kind of responsive somehow. And creation still works, right? So we're kind of done. Yeah. The last step that I've prepared is doing Caribou tests. I didn't want to do that, but I think we still have kind of 7 minutes left, and I will stop. But Caribou testing is kind of a very interesting tool because it does browserless testing. So Vaadin runs on the server, and that way we can test an application without running a browser. And that's very beneficial because Caribou tests run at the same speed as integration tests. So it's not like an end-to-end test where it takes minutes to run, it runs in seconds. And here in the test folder, I already created a Caribou test that also is integrating the test containers config, or importing the test containers configuration. And that kind of starts this mock Spring servlet and mock Vaadin setup and stuff like that. So it really creates, like, if you know Spring Boot, there's mock MVC, and what Caribou testing is kind of the same for Vaadin. And we can now to go to the final stage and just try to generate a test. And just because I'm curious now what AI will do. So I also test the use case, and this will also look hopefully at my Caribou test MCP server. And let's check it out. So it looks for the use cases, looks at the code. I also have here a kind of a hard constraint: never use Mockito, because I don't want to use mocks. I want to use test data. But that's something I didn't tell AI, because something that works very well with AI is, for example, also creating test data. That's a very good thing. And then I usually have Flyway migration scripts for the test data. Here I don't have any test data, but as you can see here, it's using my Caribou testing MCP server. So it checks how we could test CRUD, for example. Here is a tool how to generate grid tests. And that's also very important to have this MCP server because Caribou testing is kind of a niche. Bodin has its own UI unit testing framework, which was heavily inspired by Caribou testing. But Caribou testing is open source and free to use. That's why I use it in my demos, and the UI unit testing is kind of a commercial offering from Vadin. That's why I don't use it. You can use both. Both are very powerful, serve the same or solve the same problem, do both browserless testing, and that's a perfect IDE. So this here will take a while. So maybe before we go to the test, I like to conclude what we saw so far. The AI Unified process as benefits, it, in my opinion, it gets better business alignment because you have to think about requirements, about specification. You have to work with the stakeholders. So you don't start coding. You have to have the requirements first. Otherwise, you can't generate anything. And in my opinion, it's sustainable because if we have specifications and requirements, we are also are able in the future to do modernization. Because if I don't like Vadin, I could create a React frontend, for example. And because my process is not tied to any tools. Because if you use tools like Tesla or Amazon Kiro or GitHub SpecKit, you're bound to their ID. So you can't escape the tool somehow. But I don't need the tool, right? With the right specification, with the right use case definitions, entity models, and guidelines, I think this works very well. And it's iterative, so it's really agile. So because a lot of people say, hey, spec-driven is waterfall, that's absolutely not true. Waterfall, in fact, wasn't waterfall. Waterfall was also iterative, if you read Boy's documentation. But we really need to iterate on everything multiple times, on the specs, on the model, on the code, on the tests. So that's normal. But I can get traceability because using IDs everywhere, requirements, use cases, whatever, can create traceability. And on the other hand, using Git is very important. So without version control, I wouldn't do that because otherwise you cannot roll back to a state where things worked before. So let's go back to the code. It's still working. So this really takes a while because generating tests is so much harder than generating code. Generating unit tests or generating integration tests, so on the service level, is very simple, right? Because that's just calling a method. But writing tests for a UI is very difficult. So it's not only difficult if AI is doing it, it's also difficult if you would do it by hand. So I also have Playwright integrated in my project. So because end-to-end tests, this acceptance testing I would do with Playwright, but Playwright tests or any end-to-end browser testing framework takes longer. So maybe we can have a look at my project. In the meanwhile, how long the actions take. So here we had a problem. I don't know if you realized it, but we had an outage of Cloudflare. So that's why my end-to-end test here failed. It wasn't able to update the project. But as you can see here, for example, the end-to-end test that I have in my other project, a bit bigger, ran for 15 minutes. Whereas a normal build, where we have one here, runs 5 minutes. So that's everything. All the tests have like 1,500 tests or so, all Caribou tests, by the way. And they run for 5 minutes. And I have a few acceptance tests, and they run for 15 minutes. And so that's a problem for the runtime. So it's very beneficial to have this browserless testing, but it may take a while. And here we also see that it runs for some while. Let's see if I can do that. It's just maybe my MCP server is failing. Looks like. So I can show you that. Maybe I can show you to finally to get an ID of what it did with Caribou tests. Okay, let's remove the things that I did. And go to the last step. There's an example. So that's how Caribou would look like, just to give you an idea. I don't have one. Didn't generate one. No, sorry. Yeah, that's it from my side. As I said, I will do a session particular for testing, because testing, as I said, it's very difficult. And there are some techniques how to get tests better. For example, by creating examples for AI that it can look at, or to add much more guardrails in terms of how to do it, what we use, especially in terms of data management. Because what I did for my project, I created. I'm lucky because this project is multi-tenant capable as well, and so it's very simple to create for a certain test suite, for example, to create test isolation based on the tenants, for example. But I will do a session for that because it's quite a difficult part. Cool. So somehow I missed the question, but I don't see any. Let's see. Can you repeat the question? Can you repeat the questions? OYSC? Because I can't see it here. Let's wait another minute. Maybe the question will come up again. No, so I think we end here. It's already 5:30. Thanks a lot for joining my session. Stay tuned. I will post soon about when the testing session will happen, hopefully next week. And if you have any other questions, you can either find me on YouTube, ask your questions here. You can find me on Twitter, on Blue Sky, or on LinkedIn. And I'll also post you will also find my website. It's martinelli.ch in the YouTube profile, and you can go there and ask me questions by mail or whatever is suitable for you. So thanks again for watching and hope to see you in the next live stream. Bye-bye.